Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to this new deep dive. And today we're going to be talking about something that's been kind of blowing up online, the whole Karen thing.
Yeah, it's definitely been getting a lot of attention lately, and I think it's interesting because the term itself might feel new, but the behavior, I mean, it really goes way back.
Right. It feels very, very current with all the viral videos and everything,
Yeah.
but it's like you said, it's got these deeper roots that we really need to unpack, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's what we're going to be diving into today, the history of Karen behavior, so to speak, and how it connects to a much larger system of racial control in America.
Okay, so before we get too deep into the history, though, just to make sure everyone's on the same page, could you give us a quick rundown of like what we actually mean when we say Karen in this context? Like, what are we really talking about here?
Sure. So the modern Karen stereotype, right? It usually involves a white woman who leverages her privilege to kind of police and control and even harass people of color, especially Black folks.
And it's often like they're weaponizing their whiteness, right? Like using this system of racism to enforce these like arbitrary rules or even just make up reasons to call the cops.
Exactly. It's like they're saying you don't belong here. You're not allowed to be in this space, and they're using whatever means necessary to try and enforce that.
Now, you see it all the time, right?
Yeah.
In those viral videos and news stories like calling police on Black people for barbecuing in a park or jogging down the street or even just bird watching. It's wild.
It really is, and that's where social media comes in. It's definitely amplified this term and exposed just how common this behavior is. But at the same time, it's important to remember that focusing solely on individual Karens kind of misses the bigger picture here.
So it's not just about calling out individuals then. There's something deeper going on.
Exactly. To understand this Karen phenomenon, we need to understand the historical context. And specifically, we need to go back to the period after the Civil War when the South enacted what were known as the Black Codes.
The Black Codes, okay, yeah. I vaguely remember learning about those in school, but how do they connect to what we're seeing with Karens today? It seems like kind of a big jump.
It might seem that way at first, but stick with me here. The Black Codes were essentially a series of laws specifically designed to restrict the freedoms of newly emancipated Black people.
So like what kinds of things did these Black Codes actually outlaw?
Oh, they criminalized all sorts of things like vagrancy, loitering, even speaking too loudly in public. It was basically a way to maintain control and suppress Black people, even though slavery had officially been abolished.
Wow, okay, so are you saying then that Karen behavior is like a modern day version of the Black Codes?
It's not a perfect one-to-one comparison, of course, but there are some really striking parallels. Both the Black Codes and this modern Karen behavior, they rely on similar tactics to assert racial control and dominance.
Like what are some of the key parallels that you see?
Well, for one, they both police Black presence in public spaces. Then there's this weaponizing of authority, especially law enforcement. And finally, they both contribute to the social and economic suppression of Black people.
Okay, so let's break those down one by one. Can you give us some specific examples of how those parallels play out, like both back then with the Black Codes and today with Karen behavior?
Absolutely. Let's start with the policing of Black presence in public spaces.
Hmm.
Under the Black Codes, Black people could be arrested for simply gathering in groups or being in white areas without permission.
And today we see Karens challenging Black people for having a picnic in a park or swimming in a community pool. It's like they're saying, you don't belong here, just like those Black Codes did.
Exactly. It's about controlling where Black people are allowed to be, even though we have every right to exist and move freely in these spaces.
It's so frustrating because it's like they're trying to enforce these invisible boundaries, these unwritten rules, and it can be really hard to push back against that.
You're right. It's not always easy to confront these situations head on. But that's why understanding the historical context is so important. It helps us see that this behavior is not just about individual prejudice. It's connected to a much larger system of racial control that's been in place for centuries.
Okay, so we've talked about the policing of public spaces. What about that second parallel, the weaponizing of authority? How does that fit into both the Black Codes and modern Karen behavior?
Well, think about it. Under the Black Codes, white citizens often work hand in hand with law enforcement to enforce those discriminatory laws. They'd report Black people for the most minor offenses, knowing that the consequences would be much harsher for Black folks.
And it's the same thing today, right? With Karens calling the police on Black people for the slightest perceived infraction, sometimes even making up stories or exaggerating the situation. It's like they know that those interactions with law enforcement can be disproportionately dangerous for Black people, and they're willing to exploit that.
Exactly. They're essentially using the police as a weapon against Black people, often without any regard for the potential consequences.
And that can be really terrifying because you never know how those encounters are going to play out. You never know if the police officer is going to be reasonable or if they're going to escalate the situation.
That's right. It's a constant fear for many Black people knowing that a simple encounter with a Karen could quickly turn into a life or death situation.
And it's not just about physical safety either. It's about the emotional and psychological toll that these encounters take. They can be incredibly traumatizing and have a lasting impact on people's lives.
Absolutely. It's important to acknowledge that this is not just about inconvenience or annoyance. This is about real harm being inflicted on Black people, both physically and emotionally.
Okay, and the last parallel you mentioned was social and economic suppression. How does that connect to both the Black codes and Karen behavior?
Well, the Black codes were designed to keep Black people in a subordinate economic position. They limited job opportunities, restricted movement, and made it nearly impossible to accumulate wealth or property.
And today we see Karens trying to do the same thing, right? Like undermining Black businesses, trying to get Black people fired from their jobs, leaving negative reviews, making false accusations, all sorts of things.
Exactly. It might seem like an individual act of prejudice, but it reinforces this much larger system of economic inequality that has its roots in those very same Black codes.
It's heartbreaking because these seemingly small acts can have such huge real-world consequences. Imagine being a Black entrepreneur trying to build your business and constantly worrying about some Karen calling the health department on you for no reason or making up lies to damage your reputation. That's terrifying.
It is, and it highlights the fact that this behavior is not just annoying, it's actively harmful and can have a devastating impact on people's lives and livelihoods.
So how do we break this cycle? Like, what can we do to actually challenge these deeply rooted systems and behaviors?
Well, our sources highlight a few key approaches: education policy reform and community building.
Okay, let's break those down. What do they mean by education? Like, how can education help dismantle this system?
It starts with awareness. We need to educate ourselves and others about the historical roots of this behavior, how it connects to systems of oppression like the Black codes. When people understand that Karen behavior isn't just about individual rudeness, but part of a larger pattern of racial control, they're more likely to recognize it and challenge it.
Right, because knowledge is power.
Yeah.
And once you see those connections, you can't unsee them. It changes your whole perspective.
Exactly. And it's not just about individual awareness. We need to integrate this understanding into our education systems, community organizations, workplaces. It needs to be a collective effort.
Yeah.
So like we said earlier, focusing just on those individual Karens kind of misses the forest for the trees.
Yeah, it's got to be about more than just calling people out on Twitter.
Exactly. We got to address the root causes, the systemic issues that allow this behavior to flourish.
Okay, so speaking of systemic issues, we were talking about education, right? Like how can we use education to actually dismantle these systems?
Well, it's not just about knowing the facts. It's about changing hearts and minds.
Yeah.
Like helping people understand the deeper implications of this behavior and how it connects to these historical patterns of oppression.
Right, because like you said earlier, once you see those connections, you can't unsee them. It really changes your whole perspective on things.
Exactly. And it's not just about individual awareness either. We need to be incorporating this understanding into our schools, our community organizations, our workplaces. It needs to be a collective effort.
Yeah, it's like that saying, it takes a village, right?
Right.
Like we all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable society.
Absolutely. And that's why policy reform is so important too. We need to be working to change the laws and structures that perpetuate these inequalities.
So like what kind of policy changes are we talking about here?
Well, we can strengthen laws against racially motivated harassment, for one thing. We can address the systemic biases within law enforcement that make Black people more vulnerable to these types of encounters. And we can work to create policies that promote equity and justice across the board.
Right. It's like we need to attack this problem from multiple angles, right? We need to change individual behavior, but we also need to change the systems that allow that behavior to thrive.
Exactly. And alongside policy change, building strong, interconnected communities is essential.
So like, what does that look like in practice?
It means creating spaces for open and honest dialogue,
Yeah.
where people can share their experiences and perspectives and learn from each other.
It's about building empathy and understanding, right? Seeing each other as human beings rather than just these abstract representations of race or stereotypes.
You got it. And it's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in dismantling these systems of oppression. It's not just the responsibility of Black people to fix this. It's a collective effort that requires all of us to be actively engaged.
Absolutely. And speaking of being actively engaged, our sources also talk about the importance of individual accountability, right? Like it's not enough to just understand the systemic issues. We also have to be willing to call out this behavior when we see it.
You hit the nail on the head. Silence equals complicity, whether it's a friend making a racist joke or a stranger harassing someone based on their race. We have a responsibility to speak up and challenge that behavior.
I think a lot of people feel hesitant to do that, though.
Yeah.
Right? It can be scary or uncomfortable to confront someone, especially if you're not sure how to handle the situation.
I get it, but here's the thing. Even small acts of resistance can make a difference. It can be as simple as saying, hey, that's not okay, or I don't agree with that. Just that small act of speaking up can create a ripple effect.
Right? It signals that this behavior is not going to be tolerated, that we're not going to just stand by and let it happen.
Exactly. And the more people who are willing to speak up, the harder it becomes for this behavior to persist. It creates a culture where these actions are no longer acceptable.
So how can our listeners take all this information and actually apply it in their own lives? Like, what can they do starting today to make a difference?
The first step is education. Read books, watch documentaries, listen to podcasts like this one, engage in conversations with people from different backgrounds. The more you understand the issue, the better equipped you'll be to address it.
It's like that saying, knowledge is power. And the more we understand about the historical context and the systemic nature of racism, the more powerful we become in challenging it.
Exactly, and don't be afraid to have those difficult conversations. Challenge your own biases, talk to your friends and family, and speak up when you see injustice happening.
It can be tough, but those conversations are crucial. We have to be willing to get uncomfortable if we want to create real change.
You know, as we've been talking about this connection between Karen behavior and the Black codes, it makes me think, are there other seemingly modern social phenomena that might have deep roots in our country's history of racial injustice? Are there other patterns that we're overlooking because we haven't connected those historical dots yet?
That's a great question. And it's something I've been thinking about, too. It's like we've been so focused on individual instances of racism that we've missed the larger historical forces at play.
It's like that saying, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And if we can learn to recognize those rhymes, those patterns, then maybe we can start to break the cycle.
So it's not just about understanding the past, it's about using that understanding to shape a more just and equitable future.
Right. And I think that's where the real power lies. Not just in knowing our history, but in using that knowledge to create a better world.
It's about taking that knowledge and transforming it into action. And for our listeners out there, we're going to shift gears a bit in this next segment. We're going to step away from the historical analysis and focus on what we as individuals can do to challenge these harmful behaviors in our own communities. We'll be back after a short break. All right, so we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into Karen behavior and its historical connections. Now, in this last part, I want to focus on what we can actually do about all this. Like, we've talked a lot about the big picture, but what are some practical steps that our listeners can take to challenge these behaviors in their everyday lives?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right? It's like we can understand the history, we can talk about the systemic issues, but ultimately it comes down to individual action, you know, like putting that knowledge into practice.
So let's say you're out in the world and you actually witness a Karen incident happening right in front of you.
Okay.
What should you do?
Well, the first thing is to always assess the situation and prioritize your own safety. If things seem like they could escalate or get violent, your best bet is to remove yourself from the situation and call for help if necessary. You don't want to put yourself in harm's way.
Right. Safety first, always.
Yeah.
But what if it feels safe to intervene? Like, what are some ways to effectively challenge that behavior without putting yourself at risk?
Well, one approach is to engage directly with the person who's being targeted. Make eye contact, offer a friendly greeting, ask them if they're okay. That simple act of acknowledging them can really disrupt the Karen's focus and let the person being harassed know that they're not alone.
Like, you're changing the dynamic, right?
Yeah.
Sending a message that there are witnesses, that this behavior isn't going unnoticed.
Exactly. And you can also try to de-escalate the situation by calmly talking to the Karen, acknowledging their concerns, but also pointing out why their behavior is inappropriate. Sometimes just stating the obvious, like he's just walking down the street or she's not bothering anyone, can be enough to bring a little reality check to the situation.
Yeah, it's like you're injecting some common sense and reason into a situation that's often driven by emotion and prejudice.
Right. And if the situation doesn't de-escalate, documentation can be super helpful. Take photos or videos if it's safe to do so. That kind of evidence can really support the person who was targeted, especially if they decide to file a complaint or report the incident.
It's like that saying, if you see something, say something. But in this case, it might be, if you see something, record something.
Yeah.
Always prioritize safety, of course, but having that record can make a big difference.
Absolutely. And remember, you don't have to do this alone. If there are other people around, see if anyone else is willing to step in with you. There's strength in numbers. The more people who stand up to this kind of behavior, the less likely it is to continue.
It's like you're creating a human shield,
Right.
surrounding the person who's being targeted with support and making it clear that this behavior won't be tolerated.
Exactly. And even if you can't directly intervene in the moment, you can still offer support to the person who was targeted after the fact. Check in with them, listen to their experience, offer them resources or help if they need it. Just knowing that someone cares can make a huge difference.
It's about being an ally not just in words, but in actions. Showing up for people when they need it most.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of education and conversation either. Talk to your friends and family about these issues, share information online, advocate for policy changes that address systemic racism. Even small actions like these can contribute to creating a culture where this behavior is no longer acceptable.
It's like planting seeds, right?
Yeah.
You might not see the results immediately, but those seeds can grow into something powerful over time.
I love that analogy. And it brings us back to something really important. This whole conversation about Karen behavior, the black codes, a history of racial control, it's a reminder that we can't be complacent. We can't just sit back and hope things will change on their own. It takes all of us actively working to dismantle these systems of oppression.
It's not about being perfect.
Right.
It's about being aware, being willing to learn and grow, and being committed to doing the work, even when it's hard.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And honestly, that's what gives me hope. Because I see so many people, especially young people, who are hungry for knowledge, who are passionate about justice, who are willing to challenge the status quo. And that's what's going to create real, lasting change.
So to our listeners out there, I want to leave you with this thought. We've connected Karen behavior to the black codes, explored the roots of racial control, talked about ways to stand up against it. But this conversation doesn't end here. Keep asking those tough questions. Keep challenging your own biases. Keep pushing for a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect.
Well said. Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this conversation has been informative, thought-provoking, and empowering. Remember, knowledge is power, and we can use that power to create a more just and equitable future for everyone.
Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep fighting the good fight.